Hello and welcome to another episode of the Cricket and the King podcast, the podcast where Jesus is the answer to everything, and we are constantly expanding on that point. I'm your host, Ben, and today we are going to be talking about demographic collapse, especially in first world nations. And this is interesting, and hold your horses if you're like, this doesn't relate to Jesus at all. I think it does, and I'll bring it back around. But hear me out. So we have this really interesting problem in first world nations of the birth rate being super far below replacement. And I think this is threefold, okay? So there's obviously advancements in technology of birth control and, access to birth control. People are using it more readily. There was a big push in the early 80s and 90s about sex education, all that fun stuff. And then the second reason is abortion, which is super interesting because that's an ideological shift in our societies, Western societies, mostly because they're based on Christian ethics. So that shift has kind of happened over the last 20 years. And then thirdly, there's this massive cultural shift, which I know my wife and I have talked about it's a movement away from family. So the devaluing of family in modern society, I think, is one of the episodes that we did. And it's this really interesting psychological shift, right? And so that makes the problem more complex because people have a harder time changing their mind about things as they get older, and the population is getting older with substantially less children. And what's interesting about birth rates falling rapidly is that it's fine if you're slightly below replacement as a country. Like, the number doesn't have to grow. The number doesn't always have to go up for things to be successful. Obviously, there's technological innovation. So let's say, tractors are a good example. You have to hoe a field, right? And so what does it look like to till a field? Well, back in the day, you got a team of like 15 guys, and they're working their butts off, and they're able to do about 20 acres a day or less. But now we have tractors, right? You put a little bit of diesel in, you're able to do a field that is well over 1,000 acres in about 2 days, maybe less time depending on the size of your tractor. But there's this interesting thing where our birth rate didn't just go below replacement. It's like dropped off dramatically. And like I said, those three things are affecting it. So I kind of want to go through each one of those things, how they affect things, and what that looks like. Mostly because what's strange about this is that most of the population collapses that have happened globally have happened due to disease. So you have like the Spanish flu, the Black Plague, a lot of wars actually. So interestingly, as many of you probably know, during World War I, World War II, millions and millions of young men died, and that dramatically decreases a population because those are the young men. They get married, they have families, they carry on the culture in the community, blah blah blah, the thing. So there's a lot of really unique changes that have led to this place in history, and some of them are very good, right? Like, obviously, having a population this large and having the death rate globally in first world nations so low is due to advancements in medicine and hygiene and sewage and all the things that we love in our modern society, hot showers, flushing toilets, penicillin, all those great things. And so, people are living a lot longer. It's good. It's good. You get to have a long, happy, prosperous life, and there's lots of time to tell people about the Lord, which is also helpful. But there's also the issue of, so you're living longer, and then you're having less children, and then old age care accounts for about 30% of the medical costs that somebody will incur in their lifetime, sometimes more. So there are some cases in where 90% of the medical spending that happens for a person happens in the last 3 years of their life. That's not every case, but it's a very large percentage. And so as you get older and your body breaks down over time, our lovely mortal shell, it gets decrepit, you end up, needing more and more medical intervention. and also subsequently needing more and more care. Some people end up, well, not being able to go to the bathroom by themselves, not being able to bathe by themselves, not being able to eat by themselves. And so that's fine if you have a slightly below replacement rate, because there's great advancements in automation and other technologies, robotics, that are happening that could be very helpful. But it's not enough if your population degrades really quickly. And really quickly is a relative term. So I'm not fear-mongering about the end of the world here, because these problems play out over hundreds of years. Like in really extreme cases like China, where they implemented an external one-child policy, it will play out much faster. So in about 50 years, their population will be completely cut in half. And that's because, obviously, with authoritarianism, they were able to have these massive, forced abortions and all these really horrible ills and kill a really huge majority of their population. So anyway, back to that first point. So birth control, obviously, the birth control point, so the first point and the third point are tied together in that birth control and the culture of kind of devaluing family. It comes with devaluing sex and the responsibility that comes with sex. So they're kind of tied together, but they're mostly separate. So with the whole advancements in birth control and then the promotion of that technology, it's broken down our social structures in such a way that people aren't seeing sex as something that leads to children, or that's the inevitable outcome, is that you have a family and things kind of move that direction, right? It's become more of a recreational thing in our society, which obviously is not good. And in every society that has this collapse, you have this kind of laissez-faire nature towards sexuality, like the Babylonians, the Romans, the Persians, the Mongols at a certain point. I'm trying to think of other ruling parties in the world. The Spanish, the French, the British, the Dutch. You get this hyperproduction of elites. They become super indulgent in, extracurricular sexual activities. You get all these insane parties, and you hear about the crazy things, and we all obviously heard about the Epstein Island thing, which is the most deplorable form of that kind of exploration and activity. So it's really odd, because it's in the Western societies that this demographic collapse is going to take place. And so the population's getting smaller at a rapid rate, because the birth rate didn't just decline from 2.13 to 1.96 and held there. It's decreased from 2.5 to 1.6, sometimes as low as 1.1 or 1.3 in some countries. And that leads to a halving of the population basically every 50 years, but the amount of old people stays the same, right? So as I was saying before, the population collapses that happened in the past were usually due to wars and disease. That's just what killed off people and led to these kind of civilizational cycles. There's a guy named Peter Turchin. He's written a really interesting book called Secular Cycles that kind of looks into this. You can read it if you want. The summary is between every 250 and 400 years, there's these cycles that happen in history where you have a low population and abundant farmland. There's a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of innovation. There's a lot of growth. And then you get overpopulation of elites. You get exceptional decadence. And then with that comes the breakdown of the systems, the breakdown of the culture, and then things degrade, and then they're taken over by the next rising power after they experience either war or famine or some other population decimating thing. And then this kind of goes on, and power gets transferred over and over and over. And this has been happening through history. And again, I'm not doom and glooming it. I'm just like, this is something interesting that I've been thinking about, that I've wanted to talk about. Anyway, so you get this decline of people that's really rapid, usually, and it happens through wars or pestilence or whatever, and you'll get a fairly even distribution through the population of death, except in the case of war, where you get a lot of young men who are, before they've started their families, they die off. And then during plague, mostly the elderly are killed because their immune systems are weaker because they're older. And so this demographic crisis, this population devastation that's going to happen, is not going to happen because of pestilence. It doesn't look like, unless there's a biological weapon released or something, I don't know, something crazy comes out. Like COVID obviously wasn't pestilence in the same way the Black Plague was. That was massively overhyped, as we all know now. If you didn't know that, you can look at the data and research. It was very strong and potent initially, really killing a lot of people. And there was also mishandling of care because there was a misunderstanding of the disease. So people in hospitals were being put on ventilators, which was actually causing their lungs to fill with fluid, and then they would die. Which, especially in New York and places that were hit really hard by this initially, that was devastating. Lots of people did pass away, and I don't want to minimize the suffering of something. But then once we got on to the further variants and the population had time to adapt, it was much less severe. And the restrictions that were put on economically and in other ways were more detrimental than the sickness itself. And so unless we have something that's bubonic plague 2.0, like Black Death, a third of the population dies, that comes from a lab somewhere. It looks like that's probably not going to be the case. And even if it is released from a lab, diseases are motivated to survive. And so if they kill their host instantly with not great effectiveness to spread, I don't know if you guys have ever played the game Plague Incorporated. It's like where you create a plague and you have to make sure that people live long enough and engage with enough people to acquire the sickness, right? And then if you don't, if there's like a lockdown, the countries are able to take effective measures, you can actually nip it in the bud super quick. And so it's beneficial for a bacteria that's trying to survive and replicate itself to become less harmful to the host, and have the maximum spreadability, which makes it less lethal over time. Anyway, that's a whole side note. But so I was on that first point, like the birth control. So obviously the countries where when you look at the demographic map, this is, I'm on World Population Review, birth rate by country 2026. It's worldpopulationreview.com if you want to see the same graph. You can see all the developed nations, and all the Western European nations especially, have these super insanely low birth rates. And so this is by the UN. We'll go to the CIA one. Yeah, it's pretty much the same. It doesn't change very much. These birth rates are super low in these Western nations. And obviously birth control and the free love movement in the 60s had this massive ideological shift. And then the other interesting thing is that because of abortion, that's another reason that these population rates are so low. And then you need abortion because of the ideological shift. So the third point. So they're all tied. Like you have people being like, okay, sex is like a casual thing that is not going to be within the context of religious boundaries or ideological boundaries because, we've mastered science and we understand everything we can do. And if we have a kid that we don't want, we can just kill them and that's fine. I'm not saying that's fine. By the way, that's not my opinion. I'm just saying that's the world's view on that. And so then the life becomes about the self, right? So you have this very self-focused population that wants to maximize their own personal pleasure, minimize their own personal responsibility to the culture. And really, cultures and societies exist in their entirety to uphold the family. That's why they exist. That's why we have public schools and we build playgrounds and we build public pools and all this fun stuff. It's not so that we can all grow old together and demographically have no additional people. It's so that there can be places for families to thrive and raise their children. And most of the Western countries have been dealing with this birth rate problem by importing people into the nation. So immigration, obviously, is the solution that people have found because there are many people that are still having babies in the world, and then those people, because they're in such highly dense urban areas. They want to go out and they want opportunity. And a lot of the countries they're coming from are destitute just due to ideological factors and government factors and a lot of different reasons. It's kind of complex, but the gist of it is you're bringing people in, and now there's this pushback against people coming in because they're recognizing that the ideological differences don't help the society be healthy and grow. This is obviously a slow process. It doesn't happen all at once, right? But you see that there's movements in the UK starting. There's movements in the United States, in Poland, other places that are having a really hard time with these people who are systemically ideologically opposed to the Western way of life, which means they're incompatible with Western society. And that's not true of everyone that moves over. A lot of people move over and they're like, yeah, my society's junk and I want to not be part of that culture and be part of a different culture and experience success. And I wish those people the greatest of luck on their new endeavors and going to other places and adding value to the communities they're in. But that's not working as well in the Western world. So then you're left with the dilemma of the birth rate of your current indigenous populate. By indig, I just mean people that were born there and live there and are fully integrated into culture and language and all those things. You're relying on their populate, like whoever they have, the families that they create to run the civilization. And that doesn't work if you have such an insanely low birth rate, because you get an upside down pyramid is what it looks like demographically, right? Because you can't just spontaneously make more people. People are made by other people, and unless we get a Brave New World situation in which everyone's born in a tube, you're gonna see that the population just shrinks really rapidly. And then you get the problem of the elderly without people who are able to care for them in their older age. And you also have the issue of people having to basically work until they die, like a serf peasant style in the 1500s, because the civilization doesn't support their aging, basically, which we have had support of aging. Well, in the early 1900s, it was mostly the family, right? So you had a lot of intergenerational living, grandparents living with children, that sort of thing. So you kind of had more care that way. And then we moved away from that, and you have people going into homes and using, reverse mortgages and other means to pay for these very expensive institutions to take care of them and let them live as best as they can and then die in peace. I mean, that's a separate conversation, but some of the old age care facilities are just vicious. They're detrimental. They're brutal, but that's not part of the conversation today. But those things, those organizations, if you look at how many foreign care aids there are for the elderly versus domestic, that number is greatly exaggerated to the foreign side, right? So then you stop allowing those people in, you stop having immigration in as strong and profound a way as it has been in the last 30 years especially, and then you have a lack of ability to take care of your elderly. And so a lot of elderly people aren't able to go back to work. They're not able to add value to the economy. And then who's going to take care of them? And then when the money dries up, how are they going to afford for people to take care of them? Because obviously labor gets more expensive when there's less of it available, right? So if there are fewer workers and more employers, then you have the option to go to different employers, and therefore employers start competing, so they start offering higher wages and taking less profits. And that's just economics or basic economics, I guess. So you're going to have this problem of elderly people dying, like en masse. Like, I assume that probably in the next 100 years, because I don't think it's as severely pronounced right now. Like I said, China might be the exception, not the rule, because of their draconian policies. You're going to have this massive die-off of elderly people, and it will be like a plague, but it will just be focused on one specific demographic of the population. And that's super rough. And then you can't just inspire people to start having families if the culture that they're in and the way their worldview is doesn't promote having family or value having family, which I would argue, most of you probably know, we don't live in a culture that supports the family unit, that supports families growing and thriving in society. We believe in the individual more strongly than we believe in accepting the burden of family. And I know that was my worldview. Even when we were first, when I found out my wife was pregnant with my daughter, my worldview was very selfish, and I wanted to wait a really long time to have kids. I'll have kids when I'm like 27 or 30, or I'm going to wait a while, and I want to live my life, and I want to, make money and travel and do all these things. And then, obviously my worldview had to shift. So I am biased to some degree because the circumstances of my life have forced some degree of change, right? I have a family and I have to take care of them. And so my worldview had to accommodate the reality of that in my own life, and our perception becomes our reality. And obviously my reality had to guide my perception. It kind of they push back on one another, and you try to line it up as closely as you can. That's why worldview is so important to me. But you're not just going to convince a bunch of people to suddenly start having a ton of kids to support an elderly population. So you're going to get a really big problem. And what's interesting is the birth rates, even in countries that are less developed, you have a birth rate of in a country, let's say like I was just in Tanzania on a missions trip. So Tanzania is 34.8 births per 1,000 people year over year, which is that's like pretty low. The highest, I think, demographically is either Niger or Chad. No, it's Niger. So in Niger, whatever you want to call it, the birth rate is 44.46 births per 1,000 people. And that's low even for that country. It's interesting, right? Because Western culture affects these third world countries, especially with the internet. That's something that's almost never happened. That you have like internet access, like globalization, like the culture of the West or of the predominant ruling society. You can't avoid it if you're far away from it, right? It's going to impact you regardless. So people in these places are seeing the rampant individualism and kind of, it's called a selfish, non-sustainable ideology that's only really become the cultural zeitgeist in the last, let's call it 70 years, like since the 1950s, like post-World War II. And then also thinking that that's just like the normal way that things are run, whereas history shows us that that's in fact not the case. And this is a very interesting social experiment that we're doing due to technological advancement and ideological shift that's happened very dramatically. Again, society used to move very slowly, like one guy figured out how to make steel, and then he would show another blacksmith like a couple towns over, and technology would kind of spread that way. And then we had the road, like the Silk Road, like the Mongols made a lot of trade and technology exchange possible, but it didn't happen that fast, right? Like these technological advancements were happening over 300 years, and now we've had the greatest technological advance ever occur and just accelerate in a straight line upwards, basically, since the 1950s. Although in some ways, innovation has slowed down. Interestingly, this is unrelated, but the Boeing 747 fundamentally as an engineering work hasn't really changed. There's been improvements in turbines and electronic guidance technology and hydraulics to improve upon the base, but the innovation itself has largely stayed the same, which is quite interesting. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. But the map of the world as you have these cultures impacting other cultures and lowering the birth rate and lowering the birth rate and lowering the birth rate, you're going to see this interesting collapse. And then what comes out of that, like what does it look like to change that, is that the people that actually have children end up creating the next society. And the people that don't value children and have the worldview that prevents them from having families ultimately dies out. And so society is reborn in this kind of very unique and weird way. And what I how I'm bringing this back to Jesus is basically that as Christians, when it's so interesting because Jesus is saying, we're to be in the world but not of the world. And that's, it's because it's a different culture. I always joke, like people ask me if I believe in democracy or Marxism or socialism or whatever, and I say, no, I believe in a monarchy, one king, and his name is Jesus, and he will rule the whole world one day. And a perfectly just king probably is the best solution politically, because no one person makes good decisions for the whole, typically. But even with this, the ideological shift that has led to this collapse, it's kind of dispersed out everywhere, and only those that are able to see it and then actively fight against it in creating their own family's culture and their own. It's not like starting a cult either. Like, I got to be clear here. I oddly have a community of friends around me that we all do value family. So we all have between 2 and 5 kids, each one of us, and we meet all the time and we talk about our values and try to protect our kids from the I guess the broken ideology of the world. And I think it's a cool time to be able to tell people about the Lord, because people see that the way that we're running society isn't working, and they see that these problems are coming. And then when you look at a biblical worldview, when you look at the way that, Jesus valued children, and he valued marriage, and he valued all these different things, when you look at that, you see that his way is legitimately better overall. And that, the, what is it? It's a proverb or a psalm, but it's like, I delight in the law of the Lord. And it's so interesting because when God gives instruction, it actually does work. And sometimes we can't see how it won't work over these shorter time horizons, or it feels really restrictive and really unfun and uncool, especially when we're living in a culture that's completely against that. But it really is, he's has the whole of humanity in mind, and he's always watching out for all of the individuals in the world, right? And so he's given us these guidelines and ways to live life and ways to perceive the world that allow the world to be a stable and better place. And right now we're seeing a lot of instability. And that, again, not doom and gloom. Like, this is a 100-year on the horizon problem. I'll probably be dead before the extreme effects of this are felt. But it also could be a renaissance, We could find ways to innovate to take care of the aging population with automation. And I don't want to say AI, because I think that's just so overhyped. I think large language models and coding models, although they have made tasks easier, that they're going to be like the tractor. Like, you must still have an operator to some degree involved in the process. I don't think it's going to be this great detrimental whatever on society. I think it's just a new tool. And the other thing that I wanted to say was, I don't, like, when I said, like, don't start a cult, like, you can see people that try to live by Christian ideology, but live in this enclosed type structure. Like, specifically what comes to mind for me is the Amish and the Hutterites. They live in these enclosed communities, and they have weird ways of doing things, and they actually have a problem with kind of a shrinking gene pool, because nobody, or I shouldn't say nobody. There's probably an exception to this rule, but I have not yet met anyone who is like, you know what? I'm going to leave Western society and I'm going to join the Amish, or I'm going to join the Hutterites, right? It's usually they're shrinking communities, but they have lots of children. But then if those children intermarry, there's a lot of cousin stuff, and then you get problems with birth defects and other things. So they have very anti-biblical ways of bringing new genetics into the gene pool. You can look that up on your own if you want. It's super not cool, but that doesn't work long term, right? Being an isolationist doesn't work. But when you live in the world and not of the world, and you're able to love people, and you're able to express the values that God has for you and the life that God has for you, it actually ends up looking attractive to people, and you can integrate with the technology of the world, and you can integrate with the good parts of the advancement without allowing it to consume you or culturally affect you in a way that's gonna ultimately destroy you, like we're watching the world do to itself right now. Super, super interesting. Anyway, that's kind of all of my thoughts on that topic. And like I said, the answer is monarchy, a global monarchy with Jesus at the head of it. And one day he will rule the world, I guess. But right now we're watching the choices of man to, with all our advancement, with all of our kind of ceasing of certain kinds of wars and certain kinds of pestilence and disease, we're still actually facing the consequences of sin. As a civilization, and that sin is to devalue God's law, to kill unborn babies, to think that our personal pleasure and our pursuit of identity is above the law of God, basically. Super, super interesting. Anyway, thanks for listening to this little rant. I hope you learned something. I hope I didn't freak you out too bad, and that you know that I'm always hopeful. I'm always moving in a positive direction. I don't live my life like the world is ending, but I do try to live my life in a way that I can, see what's going on, be informed, and this kind of stuff interests me. If you have any questions, concerns, crises, you can reach me at the cricket and the king at gmail.com. I have written a book that has my worldview in it. It accommodates both non-Christians and Christians alike. You can buy it on Amazon or Kindle. It's called The Young Man's Manifesto. I made the cover to look like the Communist Manifesto because I thought the irony was hilarious. My worldview is super antithetical to communism. But yeah, you can buy that online, and I also have released it here free on the podcast. So if you would like to, you can listen to that for free, and then if you feel like you got value out of it, you can purchase it. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you on the next one. Bye for now.